Hello, dear friends, and welcome to episode 3 of Fantasy for Our Time. Today, I wanted to talk about a wonderful novel by C.S. Lewis called Till We Have Faces. Before we get into the breakdown of this novel that surprised me in many ways, I didn't like it the first time I read it, I want to let you all know that the reason I'm talking about it today is because we just finished reading Till We Have Faces, or we're about to finish reading the novel as part of my Patreon page's book club. We have a book club. It's a wonderful book club. We've had it for the past year and a half over at patreon.com/Nicholas Kotar, my Patreon page. We've managed to read The Lord of the Rings. We've read some really wonderful examples of both classic and modern fantasy. But the really great thing about this book club is not that we read the books, but that we talk about it. There is a wonderful group of people who have some very interesting ideas about everything that we read, and we have a great time, even though it's all virtual, it's all on Zoom. And if going on Zoom with people that you don't know particularly well is something that isn't all that appealing to you, you should know that my Patreon has a lot of other things that I offer, including an opportunity to receive every single book that I publish in ebook format from here to eternity. It's one of the things I offer my patrons. So if you're interested, check it out at patreon.com/Nicholas Kotar and come and join us if you like. Today I want to talk about something that struck me. And I think many of you have been noticing this happening on the larger cultural stage. But I'm going to couch it first in a story. Marlon James is a wonderful author of realistic fiction and fantasy. He has been up for various awards, including, I think, National Book Award. He's considered by many to be a real master of the craft. I've started to read one of his novels, but I think I'm not going to go very far in his particular oeuvre because he's very sharp-edged and quite explicit and a little bit too caustic for my tastes. Not a criticism, just a reflection more of my thin skin. But this author, Marlon James, had a conversation with a friend about The Hobbit when the movies were coming out. The Hobbit movies, that is, not The Lord of the Rings. You all should know that I have very little respect for the Hobbit movies. I think they're terrible. But we can talk about that maybe in a different episode. But in this conversation that Marlon James had with his friend, he is reported to have said that he was upset with the fact that the cast largely was not representative of America in the 21st century. And he is reported to have said something along the lines of, if they had an Asian or a black dwarf, nobody would care. Now, this conversation was had a while back when the Hobbit movies were still coming out. So I think we now know that his sanguine thought about nobody caring about multiracial dwarves or hobbits has now been largely proved false, especially ever since the beginning of the loud internet furor over the trailer for The Rings of Power. But again, that's not what I wanted to talk about today. What I wanted to talk about was that during the course of this conversation, where the friend was countering that no, people would care, Marlon James answered and said, well, what does it matter? It's not real. It's just a story. Now, this topic, what is real, what is not real, really deserves its own episode. And I think I might actually do that at some point, because this is a question that people don't give enough thought to, and I have some rather loud opinions about. But let's consider something about the fact that these people who say, what does it matter if we have multicultural dwarves or hobbits in The Lord of the Rings or in the Second Age or in The Hobbit? What does it matter if we do? Because it's not real. I think it's been proven to be, I think that's simply, they don't even believe that themselves, because there's been a real loud, there's been a lot of complaining about fans who do not like the multicultural new version of the Rings of Power. And the people who insist on diversity being something that is good for the Lord of the Rings make it very clear in their apology for including multicultural dwarves and elves that it's not a matter of this not being real. That actually it's all very much part of reality, and that it's important to have one's reality in the real world, whatever that is, be reflected properly in the fictional world. By complaining loudly on both sides, I think everybody is declaring that whether or not they say it out loud, they do believe that the world of story is much more real and much more important than perhaps they are willing to admit. Initially. So I wanted to consider about how people more intelligent than I relate to certain aspects of storytelling, specifically the hero's journey or the heroic quest or whatever you might call it, to actually show that people from all walks of life do honestly believe that these aspects of storytelling, these storytelling structures or stories themselves, are a lot more important and are a lot more significant than simple entertainment. First example is something that maybe you all have noticed, and that's Jordan Peterson, especially recently, has been talking a lot about how people are nested in stories and how being nested in a story is part of something like evolution's meaning making mechanism, is how he might put it. It's something that's not merely necessary for survival, though it is that, but it is also integral for living a life that offers consolation in the midst of suffering. He's been talking a lot about the reality of suffering, not only your own suffering, but the suffering of those around you, and it being everywhere present and constant, and how part of the way that human beings make meaning in a way that allows them to continue moving through the suffering is related to seeing themselves or others as heroes in a journey that follows, in a lot of ways, the beats of the traditional hero's journey in old fairy tales. Second example is something you might find in Jonathan Pajot, where he has repeatedly talked about the fact that the hero's journey and its essentially cyclical or repetitive nature is on some level a reflection of reality as reality actually is. So it's not merely a convention that has passed down from generation to generation, but it's something that reflects the way that the world truly is at its core. So when you read heroes' journeys, when you see them in well done versions of them on the screen, when you experience them in whatever way you do, it can result in a powerful experience of oneness and wholeness, he might say, because it takes you out of yourself and allows you to experience the world not as you see it, because the way you see the world is necessarily going to be very limited by your own experience, by your upbringing, by the limitations of your own eyes and ears, but as the world actually is. Here's a third example, and it's an example from a different perspective entirely. I recently had a conversation with a professional folklorist, or somebody who has a PhD in folkloristics, who complained to me about my constant harping about the importance of the hero's journey as a kind of universal paradigm. He says that actually most folklorists consider the Joseph Campbell version of the hero's journey, the hero with a thousand faces, to be something that is not at all universal, that it is limited largely to a very small subset of stories, largely Western ones, and that it can and does have the problematic nature of putting a preference on one kind of tradition. And invariably, of course, people coming from that perspective are going to call that tradition a colonizing and oppressive Western one, preferring that to all others. So therefore, it's not a good thing. And he also added, and other people I've heard also add this caveat, that some people, particularly young men of a certain stripe, when imbibing too much of the hero's journey's wine, can become toxic in the way that they encounter the world, because rather than seeing themselves as the hero truly is, because the hero is one who travels constantly through ever increasing cycles of disaster and coming to a resolution that is largely outside of himself, not seeing it in that sense, but seeing it in a more toxic, self-assertive, masculinity forward sense, tend to hurt innocent people around them. And I did make the argument that on a cultural level, Russia seeing itself as a spiritual kind of hero in this struggle between itself and the West, um, has led to a very dangerous worldview in which the death of innocent civilians is largely papered over as something necessary for a holy cause. I don't believe that, but there are plenty of people in Russia who will say that. So as you can see from these examples, I think it's clear that even if people might complain and say, well, it's just stories, what are you getting all in a huff about? People on all sides of the ideological spectrum do actually, in fact, agree that the reality of the hero's journey, the reality of storytelling structures in our lives, has a much higher importance than perhaps we're willing to admit. This really struck me in a very powerful way as I was finishing Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis on my bike as I was training for an adventure race that's happening next month. More on that later. Because it struck me that C.S. Lewis is doing something very profound in this, his most difficult of novels. If C.S. Lewis's previous novels, Narnia and the Cosmic Trilogy, are very clear about their apologetics, about their Christian apologetics, and are very obvious in their didactic, if not propagandistic, way of storytelling. I don't think they're propagandistic, and I think most people who are not Christians will still be able to find things to enjoy about both Narnia and the Cosmic Trilogy. But still, it's very clear what his authorial perspective is. That is not so clear on the surface of Till We Have Faces. Till We Have Faces is a very profound, very deep, very difficult novel. And the first time I read it when I was 16 years old, thereabouts, I was in the middle of a sprint reading as many books by C.S. Lewis as I possibly could, and as many books by J.R.R. Tolkien as I possibly could. This was probably my second or third time reading through The Lord of the Rings at that point. I read this book and I got to the end and I didn't understand what's going on. And partially, as I remember it now, this was a problem actually of marketing. And this is interesting just to show you how much a book really, the cover of a book really does determine a person's experience of it. In the paperback that I had, it was made incorrectly. The point was made incorrectly on the back cover blurb that this book was about a very ugly main character, a hideously ugly main character, who is later on revealed to be actually beautiful. So I thought that this was one of those traditional fairy tale type narratives where an ugly character, through a series of fairy tale story beats, which oftentimes mimic or mirror the hero's journey, comes to have a new face placed on them by the act of some supernatural entity outside of themselves, or is revealed to be actually much more beautiful than she saw herself to be. A trope that is very famously and very unsatisfactorily lampooned, of course, by Shrek, a movie that I hate very deeply. Again, perhaps a topic for a different conversation. But that's not what this book is about at all. So when I first read the book when I was 16, I kept waiting for that resolution. And when it didn't come, I was very disappointed. And in the process, I was not paying attention to what is effectively a palimpsest. Those who don't know what that technical term is, a palimpsest is a parchment that has been layered by repeated levels of writing by scribes that have crossed out or expunged in some sense previous works on a piece of parchment. Because it's so expensive, it's not particularly feasible to constantly make new pieces of parchment. It takes a long time, and it's, like I said, very expensive. So oftentimes what people would do is they would cross out or expunge existing scripts and then write new scripts on top of them. But the old scripts never really go away. They're still there because they've been etched into the skin of an animal. And nowadays you can, with certain very impressive technologies, be able to separate the different layers of the manuscript and read all of them. That's what we call a palimpsest, that multi-layered manuscript. This novel is very much a palimpsest because it has many layers of meaning that deepen the meaning of the story the farther deep you go. very much like that image in The Last Battle by C.S. Lewis, where the experience of Aslan's country is likened to the unpeeling of an onion, where each layer is larger than the one before it instead of smaller. An image that I unconsciously mirrored in my own series of novels in the Raven Sun series. Unconsciously, clearly, I had been reading C.S. Lewis a lot, and it bled through, but I didn't remember that I was actually making an allusion to The Last Battle until much later, when I reread it and realized, oh, whoops, that's what I was doing. But that's what ended up happening. In this palimpsest, the longer you sit with some of the really profound realities that he's trying to show us through a storytelling mechanism, the more I think we can be impressed with what storytelling can do to a person, I think. Because what this story is about is what it means to become human. Full stop. Which, of course, is what all stories are about. But this story is consciously about that. It's about what it really means and how that process occurs in a human life. So, in the one sense, it is kind of allegorical, because what happens to Orual and also Psyche in the background is really what happens, or what can happen, to pretty much anybody, no matter what their circumstances in life. There is this very strong applicability in the beats of both of their journeys. That can this applicability is very strongly resonant with a lot of different lifestyles. That's what I would say. But what really struck me is that there are two kinds of journeys, two kinds of storytelling structures going on at the same time in this palimpsest. And the reason that it is a palimpsest is because one of the stories is happening in the background. This is a really difficult authorial technique that some really good authors have taken advantage of. My favorite example of this actually is nothing to do with fantasy. It's in Jane Austen's novel Emma. Uh, I've read Emma several times. I've always loved Jane Austen. Initially, it was because it made me feel warm and fuzzy, the perfect resolution of all her plots. But later on, I started to really appreciate her artistry as a writer. And the last time I read Emma, I recognized that actually the author's sympathies are not with the main character. They're not with Emma. And throughout the entire novel, Jane Austen is very softly and very subtly criticizing Emma and making fun of her. And actually, I think the heroine of the story is Jane Fairfax. Now, those of you who've only watched the movie versions of this might think, what on earth? That has nothing to do with the story. Well, I challenge you to read the book again and pay attention to how Jane Austen tells the story of Jane Fairfax through subtext. How she tells the romance between her and Frank Churchill entirely through subtext. And this is what happens in Till We Have Faces, because we have a pretty traditional psychological manifestation of the hero's journey in the character of Orual, the sister of Psyche. But the journey of Psyche is going on mostly in the background throughout the course of the entire book. And we see glimpses of it through the eyes of Orual, and we see the conclusion of it in the glorious final scene of the book. And what ends up happening in that glorious final scene is something that's very profound, because what C.S. Lewis is doing through the journey of Orual and through the journey of Psyche is actually saying to us that it doesn't matter what your journey is. You might have a hero's journey that you have to go through as a human being. You might have to have a heroine's journey that you go through as a human being, and those are different, and they encompass very different kinds of human experiences. But ultimately, it doesn't matter, according to C.S. Lewis, which journey you took, because in the fulfillment of both, there is something that is universally human. And what that is something very beautiful and very profound, and we'll get to that at the end. But first, I want to break down what the hero's journey is and what the heroine's journey is through the specific lens of the character journeys of Orual and Psyche. So Orual is not a traditional hero. She's not chosen. She doesn't get a call to adventure from a mentor figure, not really. not in the traditional sense like you would see in Star Wars or in The Hobbit or in any number of very traditional hero's journeys. But she does go through many of the beats of a hero's journey because there is a call to adventure, and it is an unwilling one, but it is not one that is traditional. And I'll explain what it is. Orual, throughout most of the book, is playing a passive role to the more beautiful, the more interesting, and the more intelligent and profound character of her sister, Psyche. At a certain point, Psyche leaves the scene. You'll have to read the book to understand how. And at that point, Orual has to begin taking charge of her own life. And she has to do it in a fairly masculine way. Now, the hero's journey is not a generically gendered journey. I hate using that language, but it's now common in the larger world, so I'm almost forced to. But what I mean is, a hero can be a man and a hero can be a woman. Also, a heroine can be a man and a heroine can be a woman. What I'm expressing here is not some brand new version of gender ideology, but just simply the technical language of the structures of the hero and heroine's journey. You can have a female go through the hero's journey. The most obvious example of this recently is Wonder Woman. Wonder Woman is not a heroine, she's a hero. Point very clearly made in Gail Carriger's The Heroine's Journey, a book that I've recommended before and continue to recommend, especially to aspiring writers. It's a very good and very interesting guide in how to write, technically how to write the heroine's journey. Orual is a hero because she has to take into her own control her destiny. And she does this by going through an increasingly difficult series of tests. The first test is a literal battle against a neighboring prince who is a physical danger to her personally and to her kingdom. A challenge that she overcomes, but then leads to further challenges of her having to become a strong, independent ruler in a largely masculine mode, in the sense that she rules as kings do in that part of the world in that time of history, because that part of the world would not have had female rulers. It's a faintly Babylonian kind of setting, pre-Roman, but not very pre-Roman, first, second century BC, something like that. In a world that doesn't generally allow for female kings, she plays that role to perfection. But then she realizes, after a long life that she thought was fairly well lived, the rug is pulled out from underneath her, and she realizes that all of her life was a sham. Now, this is the dark night of the soul portion of the hero's journey that every hero must encounter, and that is usually preceded by what is called an apparent victory, where the hero thinks that he or she has come to overcome the central problem of her or his life. And she certainly thinks that is the case for her. She believes that she has overcome the singular problem in her life, which was her great sadness at losing Psyche. But in a beautiful moment where she encounters the myth of her life in a fairy tale fashion, which is very different from the way that she thinks her life went, she is forced to encounter the reality that her whole life, the way she saw it, was a lie. And actually, she had been wrong about everything. And this leads to something called the dark night of the soul. And she has to go through a kind of transformation through an underworld. And this underworld is represented largely by a series of visions or waking dreams, until she comes to the conclusion of it by a eucatastrophic intervention from divine agents, which often happens in the hero's journey. And she comes to the end of her journey being transformed physically. And she sees a reflection of herself. Mirrors play an important role in the story at various points, where she sees a reflection of herself as being a very beautiful, slightly different version of her beautiful sister, Psyche. A very strange and very beautiful and very interesting resolution to the traditional hero's journey, at which point she dies. And that's the end of her story. But she dies having fulfilled the purpose of the hero's journey, which is always to come back to one's community and infuse it with your own transformation. And the novel ends with a report from the chief priest of the goddess Ungit, who lets us know that actually the way that she saw herself was incorrect in almost every respect. And that in spite of her perhaps personal failings, or rather spiritual failings, she was in fact a universally loved ruler. And this in spite of the fact that nobody had ever seen her face. She had physically veiled herself to hide her ugliness from the moment that she became queen. Very interesting idea that is worth thinking about and talking about perhaps later. So that's the hero's journey of Orual. Now, Psyche's journey is a traditional heroine's journey. And in a lot of ways, it reflects the journey of Persephone, which is the archetypal heroine's journey. The heroine's journey is something like this. The heroine loses something that is dear to her, usually some form of family. And she loses this most of the time, not because of her own fault. And it's complicated, or it's more complicated than that in the story of Cupid and Psyche, or in the novel Till We Have Faces, because she does, in fact, cause this loss herself, at least partially. Even if her intentions were not evil, she still did it. And because of this loss, and this loss was a loss of everything, it was a loss of family, it was a loss of home, it was a loss of love. She is forced to wander the earth, and she does so by changing her aspect. This often happens in heroines' journey, where they change the way they look, or they assume another persona. And she does this by veiling her beauty in black, in an interesting counterpoint to Orual's veiling her ugliness in something that is a sheer fabric, not black, probably off-white. There's a lot of contrasts as you're getting in this novel. And then she is forced to undergo a series of difficulties or impossible tasks that are assigned to her by the Venus analog in the story, the goddess Ungit. And she's only able to go through these impossible tasks and achieve them, not as the hero does, because the hero must overcome these difficulties by going out by himself into the wilderness and overcoming them on his or her own. She does this through the mediation of a found family, of a series of characters that are attracted to her by the innocence of her plight, or by the beauty of her person, or by some other attractive quality. In the original myth, the Roman myth, these are a series of characters, including the god Pan, a divine eagle, and eventually Cupid himself. In this novel, the found family is actually her family. It is Orual herself who is given the opportunity to bear the burden of Psyche's difficulty, bear the pain of Psyche's impossible tasks through a very interesting device of the waking dream or vision, where she's physically present in some ineffable way in all of Psyche's trials. And at the end of the heroine's journey, there is a restoration of what she has lost that is usually not one that is as triumphant as the end of the hero's journey. It is usually accompanied by a certain degree of compromise and moral ambivalence. It's generally a happy ending, but one that isn't completely happy, and it still bears the fruits of bitterness that were present at the beginning. Whatever the event might be that caused the initial loss to happen. So both journeys, both hero and heroine's journey, are unresolvable on some level, because the hero returns home, and then everything that happens for the rest of his life is outside of the bounds of the story. We assume that he is able to come and transform his community around him, but we don't generally see that transformation. We assume it happens, we hope it happens, we don't see it. So there is a bit of ... that happens. And in the heroine's journey, the moral ambivalence of the compromised ending is one that allows for a certain degree of joy and happiness, but not a completely fulfilling one. And both of these, of course, reflect reality in a very realistic way. Because if the hero's journey is a masculine archetype in the sense that it follows a very active going out outside of yourself out into the wilderness, which is traditionally a masculine trope, and the heroine's journey is traditionally a more feminine trope, both of them are fraught with the tragedy of the human condition. There is no ultimate happy ending for both, unless there is some eucatastrophe, as Tolkien would put it. And the eucatastrophe is largely outside, the good catastrophe is largely outside of the realm of story itself. So why am I talking about this? The reason is that, as I've tried to express with my 3 examples of people talking about the importance of these storytelling structures, the reality is that if we enter into the world of story, it does have a very profound effect on how we see ourselves in our lives. There is really compelling evidence, a point I make repeatedly in my series on how stories can unite us during dark times. There is a very good reason to believe that the deeper we enter into storytelling realms, the more they affect us actually in our everyday lives. So the kinds of stories we read, the kinds of movies we watch, the kinds of audiobooks we read do have an actual palpable influence on how we live and how we affect people around us. Again, if this is a point that you don't think I've made sufficiently well, I do recommend that you check out my series on stories that unite during dark times. Listen to the outro of the podcast to find out how you can get it. Lewis certainly understood this. He understood the power of storytelling to transform lives in a very real way. So what he's doing at the end of Till We Have Faces is offering a way out of both the hero and the heroine's journey that is transcendent in a very real sense. Because what happens at the end is an encounter with the divine. Now, there have been intimations of how this encounter with the divine might happen, and Orual consistently fights it off. She doesn't want to have anything to do with the divine, playing the role of the angry atheist in a lot of ways. But Psyche is almost too eager and too gullible and too happy in her experience of the divine, especially before she's married to the god of the mountain. She's almost naive in her expectation that the divine will always have our best interest at heart, in the sense that our best interest will always mean happy and good things in this life. Both of them are found to be wrong. And both of them come to the realization that the real purpose, or that the real, not the purpose, but the real way that the divine and the human interact in this earth is one primarily of pain. And that pain is actually a good thing. And it's an inevitable thing, because it is the pain of acquiring a face where you didn't have one before. This is a really interesting thing, because usually we think of scouring or taking off layers to get to the more true layer underneath when we're talking about encounters with the transcendent. But here it's almost as if the humanity, the real true humanity of Orual, is not fully realized in her life. She is like a blank slate, or like the blank face of a stone. And her true aspect, her true face, needs to be carved out of the rock. And the only one who can carve it out is the god of love, incidentally. But of course, that process in a rock that is living is going to be excruciatingly painful. And the experience of it is not going to be a particularly pleasant one, except for perhaps certain small intimations of beauty that Orual consistently, like I said, slaps down and wants nothing to do with. But once she passes through it, and once Psyche passes through the difficulty of her trials, they both come to see themselves in the reflection of the lake in the country of the gods that one can only see in the light of the coming of the divine. And they are both far more human and far more beautiful than they ever were in life. This is the ultimate fulfillment of both the hero and the heroine's journey. If we read a hero's journey and we find ourselves resonating with it. Or if we read a heroine's journey and find ourselves resonating with it, we are taken on this journey, but that journey can only take us to a certain point at which we are left to our own devices to figure out the rest of our lives. And oftentimes what that means is that we complete or repeat the cycles again and again and again, which is why we like to return to stories again and again and again, because they remind us of the need to go through those painful cycles of self-renewal. But this book is reminding us that at the end, ultimately, there is a fulfillment, there is a catharsis, there is a way out of the constant cycle. And that is found in an unveiling, an uncovering, an unmediated encounter with the divine that can be partially experienced here on earth. That is C.S. Lewis's message. And it is a very beautiful one, I think, to anybody, no matter what your belief, because it's a realistic one and it's an honest one. Too often, people of all faiths and all traditions, even those who don't particularly subscribe to any faith, tend to see the divine as something that is benevolently smiling on us at all times. And then when catastrophe comes, almost like small children, we look up with surprise and pain in our eyes and say, "Why, God? Aren't you good to us?" And it doesn't even matter if you believe in him. You might still be mad at him. Something you see oftentimes in the sort of archetypal angry atheist of the perhaps Stephen Fry kind. It's naive to think that the divine in the world as it is manifested is always out for your own good. Meaning it is out for your own good, but it's not always out for your own pleasure. It's not always there to make you feel good about yourself. Oftentimes, the way that it encounters us, because of its surpassingly transcendent quality and our limitation as human beings, however you might see that, I see it in a certain way, of course, that clash between what is greater and what is lesser will necessarily be one of pain. And it's necessary to pass through it. Why? Because through that passage, we get faces, all of us. And I think that's a profoundly beautiful thought. And that's the thought I want to leave you with today. And that's something I would like you to consider as you continue to read whatever stories that you do read. Because these stories do help us deal with the very hard reality of our life. Because our lives are often very hard. And especially now as things continue careening from worse to worse reality, as we're going from pandemic to war to God knows what's coming next. This is a good reminder that whatever we do pass through, our stories tell us that the heroes of those stories, as they pass through it, they are cleaned. They are scraped of unnecessary things. They are acquiring a face. And that is a good thing.